One night, a small spaceship crash-landed on the Breyer family farm. Inside was a baby boy, and without hesitation, Tori and Kyle decided to adopt him. Tori, who had long dreamed of having a child, was thrilled and adored the boy, naming him Brandon. Brandon grew up to be exceptionally smart, though his classmates often teased him. When Brandon turned 10, he began hearing strange voices speaking in an unknown language. Listening to these voices, he would enter a trance-like state, which greatly worried Tori. One night, she found Brandon near the basement where the alien spacecraft was hidden. He was violently pulling at the doors, muttering unintelligible words that sounded more like growls than human speech. Alarmed, Tori touched him, snapping him out of the trance. Brandon was completely disoriented, unable to explain what he was doing or where he was. As they left the basement, a sinister red glow emanated from the spacecraft beneath the floorboards. Tori and Kyle dismissed the incident as sleepwalking. Over time, Brandon discovered he had superhuman abilities, including immense strength and invulnerability to harm. On his 12th birthday, the Breyer family celebrated at a small diner, joined by his Aunt Marilee and Uncle Noah. Brandon was overjoyed to receive a hunting rifle as a gift. However, Kyle objected, saying it was inappropriate for a child and tried to take it away. For the first time, Brandon disrespected his adoptive parents, ruining the celebration. Back home, Tori defended Brandon, saying it was typical teenage behavior. She reminded Kyle that they had acted even worse at that age. Kyle reluctantly agreed and suggested a family camping trip to bond with Brandon. On the day of the trip, Kyle found Brandon deep in thought, so distracted he didn't realize he was chewing on a metal fork. Meanwhile, Tori went to Brandon's room to grab a jacket, but discovered a disturbing collection of magazine clippings. At first, they depicted beautiful women, but as she looked closer, she found surgical diagrams and even photographs of human organs. Shocked, Tori asked Kyle to talk to Brandon about the troubling discovery. During the camping trip, Kyle awkwardly brought up the topic of growing up, trying to reassure Brandon that his emerging feelings were normal for his age and nothing to be ashamed of. Brandon didn't respond, leaving Kyle unsure if the message got through. That same night, Brandon snuck out and went to his classmate Caitlin Kipling's house. Using his super speed and ability to fly, he repeatedly turned on the music on her laptop, terrifying her. When Caitlin spotted him hiding behind the curtain and screamed, her mother rushed into the room but found no one. Back at the farm, Kyle notices Brandon sitting on some chickens. He asks if Brandon is all right, and Brandon calmly acknowledges that he is. They head inside. Later, Tori and Kyle go outside and discover all the chickens have been killed. Tori suspects a wolf, but Kyle believes Brandon is responsible, noting he was out there earlier. The next day at school, Brandon and his classmates participate in a trust fall exercise. Caitlin, nervous about the events from the other night, doesn't say anything. During the exercise, Brandon falls to the ground after a classmate fails to catch him. Although unharmed, Caitlin refuses to help him, calling him a pervert. Brandon denies this, but the coach forces Caitlin to assist him. As she does, Brandon suddenly crushes her hand, leaving her screaming in pain. Later, in the principal's office, Tori tries to explain to Caitlin's mother that Brandon is sorry and that accidents happen. Caitlin's mother, however, is unconvinced and demands the sheriff arrest Brandon. The sheriff refuses, saying Brandon will be placed in special sessions at school instead. Brandon sits silently while the adults argue. Caitlin's mother angrily claims that a psycho gave birth to Brandon, but Tori defends him. As the family leaves, Brandon gives Caitlin's mother a menacing stare. That same day, the mother saw her son drawing some very suspicious pictures, similar to a Spider-Man costume, and also symbols, as if he wanted to become the new Superman. Evil Superman. That night, Brandon overhears Kyle and Tori talking about him. Tori later reads up on meteors and notices something unusual happening in the barn. She rushes outside and finds Brandon levitating, surrounded by a glowing light from the meteor. Brandon chants, "Take the wall." As Tori approaches, he falls and cuts his hand on the meteor. Tori tries to calm him down, but Brandon becomes enraged, shouting that he came from the sky and accusing Tori of lying to him. He storms off. Tori tells Kyle about what Brandon discovered. Meanwhile, Brandon walks alone, screaming in frustration and firing lasers from his eyes. Later, Brandon visits Caitlin in her bedroom. While she types on her laptop with her uninjured hand, Brandon reassures her not to be afraid and reminds her of how special he is. Caitlin tells him her mother doesn't want her to speak to him, but Brandon ominously replies that he'll take care of that. He leaves a flower on her desk and departs. At the diner, Caitlin's mother closes up shop, but senses something is wrong. She notices diagrams on the windows, similar to those Brandon had drawn in his notebook. The lights flicker before the windows suddenly shatter, and a shard of glass injures her eye. Panicked, she grabs a baseball bat and retreats to the cooler, locking the door. Brandon uses his laser vision to burn through the door and rips it open. He menacingly stares at her before charging and presumably killing her. The next morning, Brandon assures his parents that everything is fine. Meanwhile, at the diner, a sheriff and his deputy investigate Caitlin's mother's death and find one of Brandon's diagrams on the window. Later, Marilee, who is also a counselor, tries to speak with Brandon, but he remains distant and refuses to explain his behavior. The session leads nowhere, and Marilee considers informing the police. At a bar, Kyle talks to his friends about Caitlin's injury and begins to suspect Brandon might be a monster. Meanwhile, at home, Marilee experiences flickering lights in the bathroom. Brandon later visits her, asking her not to go to the police, saying it would not end well for anyone. Marilee tells him to go home and Brandon leaves. Or, so it seems, he stands outside her window watching her text Noah. Later, Brandon sneaks back into her house wearing his costume. When Noah returns home, he finds Brandon hiding in the closet. He escorts Brandon out and threatens to tell his parents. As Noah loads his truck, Brandon suddenly throws him against the garage door. Noah gets into his truck and drives away, terrified. But he realizes Brandon is following him. The truck suddenly swerves out of control and loses power. Noah tries to restart it, but sees Brandon appear in front of them, causing him to scream. Brandon lifts the truck into the air, levitates it briefly, and then slams it back down. The crash results in Noah's jaw being gruesomely broken. As Noah lies dying, Brandon calmly carves one of his symbols into the ground using Noah's blood. Brandon returns home, claiming he was playing soccer the whole time. He explains that he lost his shirt because he was bullied. That night, Kyle has a nightmare about how Tori found Brandon as a baby in the meteor and decided to adopt him. In the dream, Brandon's eyes suddenly glow with lasers, startling Kyle awake. A phone call interrupts his thoughts, and Kyle and Tori are summoned to the hospital, where Marilee tells them that Noah has been killed. She reveals that Brandon visited her before Noah's death, deeply concerning Kyle. The next morning, Kyle and Tori inform Brandon about Noah's death. Brandon coldly responds with, "Okay," leaving Kyle suspicious. Kyle accuses Brandon of being involved, but Tori tries to calm him down. Brandon suddenly shoves Kyle into the pantry, breaking the doors. Tori sends Brandon away, trying to manage the escalating tension. Later, Kyle discovers Brandon's shirt with blood on it and secretly takes it. He apologizes to Brandon for earlier, but Brandon simply replies with another dismissive, "Okay." Kyle shares his discovery with Tori, but she refuses to believe him. Meanwhile, the sheriff investigates Noah's death and finds similarities between the diagrams Brandon drew and symbols found at the scene. Tori tries to comfort Kyle, who reviews Brandon's old birthday cards, struggling to come to terms with what's happening. The next day, Kyle decides to take Brandon on a hunting trip. While in the woods, the sheriff visits Tori to show her evidence linking Brandon to the incidents. Tori remains in denial but is visibly shaken by the photos. Back in the woods, Kyle and Brandon follow deer tracks, and Kyle lets Brandon walk ahead. At home, Tori finds Brandon's notebook, containing the same diagrams from the crime scenes, sketches of his costume, the shard of glass in the waitress's eye, and drawings of dead people alongside the words, "Take the world." Realizing the truth, Tori panics. Meanwhile, Kyle takes aim and shoots Brandon, but the bullet harmlessly bounces off his head. A startled Brandon looks at Kyle, who frantically tries to reload. Before Kyle can fire again, Brandon vanishes. Kyle runs through the woods in a panic, but Brandon, now wearing his hood, flies around and taunts him. Brandon finally tackles Kyle, forcing him to sit up. Kyle tries to apologize, but Brandon fires lasers from his eyes, killing Kyle instantly. Back at the house, Tori frantically tries to call Kyle, but there's no response. Brandon finally answers her call, coldly stating that Kyle is gone and that he's coming home. Terrified, Tori calls 911, but Brandon flies through the house at incredible speed, destroying it. The sheriff and his deputy arrive in response to the emergency call, only to find the house in ruins. Tori steps outside as the sheriff calls out to her, but before she can explain, Brandon attacks and tears the sheriff apart. Panicking, Tori and the deputy retreat inside the house. Tori hides upstairs while the deputy searches for Brandon with her gun drawn. She calls for backup, but is ambushed by Brandon. who brutally kills her off-screen. Hearing the gruesome noises, Tori remains silent as Brandon searches for her. She escapes out of a window and crashes to the ground, then runs to the barn where the meteor is stored. In the barn, Tori remembers how the meteor shard injured Brandon before. She grabs a shard only to stumble upon the body of the waitress. Hiding the shard, she calls out to Brandon, who appears wearing his hood. Tori pleads with him, saying he means everything to her. As she removes his hood, Brandon looks at her innocently. They embrace. But when Tori attempts to stab him with the shard, Brandon catches her hand and forces her to drop the weapon. Enraged, Brandon flies Tori several hundred feet into the air. He gives her one final look before releasing her, causing her to fall to her death. As Brandon levitates in the sky, an oncoming plane approaches. The next day, the wreckage of the plane is shown, with no survivors. Reports indicate the plane crashed into the farmhouse, killing Kyle and Tori. Meanwhile, Brandon sits calmly, eating a cookie with an innocent expression. During the end credits, cities lie in ruins, and millions die at Brandon's hands.